The second thing they took was her voice. Not literally. Not at first, but in the way silence is carved into a person when they learn, early and brutally, that speaking only brings pain. She had been 6 years old the first time she understood this. 9 the second time. By the time she was 17, silence had become her second skin, worn so well that most people had forgotten she was even capable of words. They called her Ashgirl. Not because it was her name. Because she slept near the hearth in the servants' corridor, curled on a mat of rough woven wool, breathing soot-tinged air, while the rest of the Blackmere Pack household slept in beds that smelled of cedar and pine. Because when the embers died and the great hall grew cold in the hours before dawn, it was her job, always her job, to coax the fire back to life. Ash-stained fingers, ash-gray dress. A girl who lived in the margins of heat and smoke. Her real name was Selene Voss, but no one in the Blackmere compound had spoken it aloud in 11 years. She moved through the great stone halls of Blackmere. Keep the way water moves through rock, quietly, persistently, leaving no visible mark. She carried trays before dawn. She laundered the beta's hunting leathers in water so cold. Her fingers went numb by the third rinse. She pressed her back against the wall when warriors passed, dropping her gaze to the floor, making herself small and invisible and forgettable. Forgettable was safe. Being remembered, being noticed. That was how you ended up like her mother. The keep was vast and cold, carved from black granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Banners of deep crimson and obsidian hung from iron rods along the main corridor. The Blackmere colors, wolf and crescent moon. And beneath them, the household moved like clockwork. Ranked warriors in their leathers and silver-threaded tunics. Omegas and servants with their eyes down and their hands always busy. The beta female Marin, clicking her tongue at anyone who moved too slowly. The Gamma's mate throwing scraps to the hounds. And at the center of it all, like a wound that never healed, the empty seat at the head of the great hall. The Alpha King's seat. He had not visited Blackmere in 3 years. Selene had overheard the warriors whispering about it. About why the Alpha King Cale Ardenmore had stopped making his annual circuit of the northern packs. About what had happened at the Thornwood Summit. That had turned him cold and reclusive and terrifying. In a way that was different from the terrifying he'd always been. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself that the less she knew about the politics of wolves, the better. She was not Pack. She had never been declared Pack. She was something else entirely. Something the Blackmere household kept like a useful tool, or an old secret, depending on the day. But that morning, the morning everything began to break apart. Even Selene's careful, practiced indifference shattered. She was carrying a tray of hot water and salted soap to the beta's private chambers when she heard it. A horn, low and long and resonant, the kind that traveled for miles through mountain air and arrived in the chest like a fist. One long note, then 2 short bursts. The herald pattern. Selene's tray tilted. She caught it before anything spilled. Pressed herself into the alcove beside the 3rd-floor landing and listened. Below her, the household erupted. "He's coming!" Someone gasped. One of the junior Omegas, a girl named Frey, who had been kind to Selene exactly twice and indifferent the rest of the time. The Alpha King, he's sent advance riders. He arrives by nightfall. The words landed in Selene's stomach like cold iron. By nightfall. She did not move for a long moment. She stared at the roughened stone of the alcove wall and felt something stir inside her. Something she had spent 11 years burying beneath silence and ash, and the practiced blankness of survival, fear. But underneath the fear, something older, something that remembered. She had 12 hours to become invisible. Selene worked faster than usual that day, moving through the keep's chores with mechanical efficiency. She beat rugs in the courtyard until her arms ached. She polished the long refectory tables until the wood gleamed dark as water. She pressed herself into every task that would keep her away from the main hall, away from the gates, away from any place where arriving guests might cast their eyes around and accidentally see her. But the keep was not large enough for hiding. Not really. By mid-afternoon, the compound hummed with a different kind of energy. Charged, electric, anxious. The Alpha King's arrival did that to people. It's stripped away the comfortable hierarchies and reminded everyone. from the highest-ranked warrior to the lowest servant, that there existed in the world a power so ancient and absolute that all of their carefully maintained order was simply his to unmake. Marin caught Selene near the kitchen corridor. The beta female was a tall, angular woman with iron-gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes the color of old amber. She had never been cruel to Selene, not in the way the Alpha's old second Draven had been before his exile. But she had never been kind either. She looked at Selene the way you look at furniture you're not sure whether to keep. "You'll serve the evening feast," Marin said. Not a request. Selene's hand stilled over the pot she'd been scrubbing. "I thought Frey and the others. I need every body in that hall tonight." Marin's tone left no room for argument. "Clean dress. Hair covered. Eyes down. You know how to be invisible. Do it better than you've ever done it." She walked away before Selene could answer. Eyes down, be invisible, yes, she knew how. He arrived at dusk. Selene heard the gate open from the scullery window. She'd pressed herself beside it, watching through the narrow gap with her breath held, and she saw them first as shadows. A column of riders moving through the early dark, torchlight catching on armor and the silver threading of rank-marked cloaks. 12 riders, then 4 more, then, behind them, a gap, deliberate, symbolic, the visual language of someone who required space, because their presence alone displaced the air around them. And then the Alpha King. She had not seen him in 11 years. She had been 6 years old the last time he'd come to Blackmere, and even then she'd only glimpsed him from a distance. A tall figure at the gate, speaking with the old Alpha in tones that didn't carry. He was not a distant figure now. Cale Ardenmore rode a black horse, the size of a small building, and he sat it the way some men sit thrones, not comfortably exactly, but as if comfort was simply beneath consideration, as if the horse was merely a formality between him and wherever he intended to be. He wore no crown. He didn't need to. The crown was in the way the riders around him unconsciously adjusted their posture when they drew near him. The crown was in the way the Blackmere warriors at the gate straightened, so sharply they almost trembled. He was younger than she expected. That was the first shock. She knew his age in the abstract way you know a fact without truly processing it. 31, the story said, youngest Alpha King to claim the Northern throne in 4 centuries. But knowing a fact and seeing it were different things. He was lean and broad-shouldered, his dark hair shorter on the sides and longer on top, windswept from riding. His jaw was clean-shaved, sharp as a cut, and his eyes. He looked up, not at the gate, not at the assembled household waiting to receive him in the courtyard. He looked up at the keep wall, and though the scullery window was narrow and shadowed and she was standing back from the light, his gaze went directly, precisely, to where she stood. Selene stepped back. Her heart hammered so hard she heard it in her skull. He couldn't have seen her. The window was narrow. She was in shadow. It was dusk, and his eyes would have been adjusting to torchlight. It was coincidence. It had to be coincidence. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed slowly and told herself it meant nothing. Part 2. The great hall was transformed. Selene had helped lay the tables herself that afternoon. Deep red candles in iron holders, bowls of dark winter berries, the best Blackmere linen that smelled faintly of lavender from the cedar chest, where it was stored between royal visits. The kitchen had been producing food since before dawn. Roasted boar, venison in blackcurt reduction, braised mountain roots and smoked river fish, 12 different honey meads, because the Alpha King was known to appreciate a fine mead, and the Blackmere Bida would not risk being found lacking. Selene carried plates and pitchers, kept her head down, eyes on the floor or on the task immediately in front of her, nowhere else. The Alpha King sat at the head of the long table. Blackmere's acting Alpha, Draven, had been exiled, replaced by a younger male named Cassian, who wore his authority like new clothing, not quite comfortable in it yet, sat to his right. Marin sat to his left, her posture perfect, her smile calibrated. Around them, ranked warriors and guests, the room thick with wolf politics and careful conversation. Selene moved along the far edge of the room. Poor, step back, poor, step back. She was almost certain she was invisible. Then the Alpha King's goblet ran low. It happened in the gap between 2 conversations. She saw it from the corner of her eye. the level of the dark mead dropping. And none of the other servers were positioned close enough, and Marin's eyes flicked to Selene with a very specific meaning. Go. Selene approached. She kept her face down, her stest, and reached across the corner of the table to refill the goblet with the smooth efficiency of long practice. She was already withdrawing when the voice hit her. Low, quiet, carrying the absolute ease of someone who had never in their life needed to raise their voice to be heard. Stop. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It traveled through the noise of the hall like a blade through cloth. Every person near the head of the table stilled. Selene stopped. Her hand tightened on the pitcher. Look at me. She raised her eyes slowly. The way you raise your face to sun you're not sure won't burn you. The Alpha King was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Intent. Focused, stripped of the careful social performance that everyone else at the table was maintaining. Up close, his eyes were extraordinary. Dark gray, almost charcoal, with something in their depth that suggested they had seen things they would not forget, and had decided to make peace with that fact. He studied her face for 3 long seconds. Around them, the table had gone very quiet in a strained trying not to look way. What's your name? He said. Selene's throat worked. She felt Marin's gaze burning into her from across the table, a sharp warning pressure. Ashgirl, she said quietly. My lord. Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't name it. That's not a name, he said. That's a description. She had no answer for that. He was right, and they both knew it. He held her gaze for another moment. Long enough that the silence became uncomfortable. Long enough that Cassian cleared his throat. And then the Alpha King looked away, and the conversation resumed, and Selene withdrew to the shadows at the edge of the room, and stood there with her heart beating too fast, and her mind completely, utterly blank. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her mat beside the cold hearth, the ash smell all around her, and stared at the dark ceiling and told herself that it meant nothing. A man like Cale Ardenmore spoke to dozens of people, daily. He asked names because it was the kind of thing powerful people sometimes did, to demonstrate their awareness of those beneath them. It was a power gesture, nothing more. It meant nothing. She almost believed it. At the 3rd hour after midnight, when the keep had gone fully silent, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the servants' quarters. Not the heavy tread of guards on their rounds, not the soft shuffle of another servant heading to the privy. Measured, deliberate footsteps that stopped outside her door. Then a knock. 3 sharp raps. Official, not tentative. Selene sat up. She pulled on her gray dress and opened the door. One of the Alpha King's personal guard. A woman with a shaved head and a silver ring through her nose, wearing the black and silver livery of the Crown Guard, looked at her with the expression of someone who has been given an order they find neither interesting nor troubling. The Alpha King requires your presence, the woman said. The cold of the corridor pressed in around Selene's bare feet. Now, she said. Now. Part 3. What the Fire remembered he was sitting alone. They had given him the Lord's Solar. The best chamber in the keep, with its own hearth and a window that looked out over the mountain valley. He'd dismissed the fire tender, and done it himself, apparently, because the hearth was burning well and warmly, and there was no one else in the room except him and, now, her. He was standing at the window when she entered, still dressed. The guard had left them. The door was closed. Selene stood near the entrance and waited. Sit, he said without turning. There was a chair near the hearth. She sat. He turned eventually, and studied her across the room with that same intense, searching quality from the dinner table. As if he was trying to reconcile 2 things that didn't quite fit. Tell me surname, he said again. They call me. I know what they call you. A pause. I'm asking what you're called. The distinction was so precise as it's hurt in some way she couldn't articulate. Selene looked at the fire, the familiar warmth of it, the familiar smell of ash and burning wood. All her life comfort had come in the form of heat and the dark. She had learned to find shelter in things that were not actually shelter. Selene, she said. The word felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd once known and mostly forgotten. Selene Voss. The name landed in the room and seemed to expand in the silence. Cale Ardenmore went very still. Not the stillness of someone relaxed. The stillness of someone who has just heard something that requires them to recalibrate everything around it. Voss, he said. Yes. Riven Voss's daughter. The name of her father, spoken so flatly, so certainly, in a room she hadn't expected to hear it, was like cold water on fire. Everything in her clenched. He's dead, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I know. Another pause. He moved away from the window, and she tracked him from the corner of her eye. Not looking directly, the old habit. He settled into the chair across from her, and now they were separated only by the fire. I was there when he died, or close enough to it. Selene's breath caught. What? The word came out before she could stop it. Kael's eyes, those storm-gray eyes, met hers directly and held. Riven Voss was not a simple man, he said carefully, in the tone of someone choosing each word with precision. He was the most gifted intelligence operative the Northern Crown has ever employed. He was also, at the time of his death, carrying information that 3 separate factions would have killed to possess. He let that settle. I was told he died in a border skirmish, Selene said slowly. That's what they said. You're saying they were wrong. I'm saying what they told you about his death was designed to protect certain people who benefited from his silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere distant in the keep, a dog barked once and was quiet. Selene stared at the man across from her. This Alpha King, who had walked into her careful, invisible life 12 hours ago, and was now methodically dismantling the story she had been told, about why she was here, about who she was, about what had been done to her family. Why are you telling me this? She said. The question came out without calculation. Raw, real. Kael Ardenmoor looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time she saw something behind the controlled precision of his expression. Something that looked almost like guilt. Because I've owed you this conversation for 11 years, he said. Part 4, the weight of kept secrets. She listened. She sat in that chair beside the fire in the Lord's Solar and listened to the Alpha King of the North dismantle 11 years of silence with the careful, measured certainty of a man who had rehearsed this and still found it difficult. Riven Voss had been more than an intelligence operative. He had been the primary architect of a treaty. A secret treaty, kept from the formal pack council, between the Northern Crown and a group of packs along the eastern border who had been pressing for autonomy for decades. The treaty would have redrawn territorial lines, changed the power structure, cost certain high-ranking wolves in the council their influence. There were 3 members of that council who had decided the treaty must not exist, and since could not destroy the treaty without destroying the man who'd built it. Since Riven Voss was protected, decorated, lauded, too visible to disappear. They had chosen a different route. They had waited. They had found a moment when Kael Ardenmoor, then 17 and not yet Alpha King, had been traveling in the north with a limited guard. They had manufactured a skirmish, staged perfectly, casualties convincingly real, and in the confusion, Riven Voss had been separated from the group and killed by men who were never identified. His daughter had been 6 years old. His mate, Selene's mother, had died 3 months later of a grief that had no medical name, but that everyone understood perfectly. And the girl had been placed in the custody of the Blackmere Pack, under the authority of their then Alpha, who had owed the council members a considerable debt. Not as a ward, not protected, simply removed from sight, given a mat and a gray dress and a name that wasn't a name. You knew, Selene said. Her voice was steady. She had no idea how. Not at first. Kael's jaw tightened. I knew your father died in the skirmish. I didn't learn the truth until I took the throne 4 years later, and by then, you'd been in Blackmere for 7 years. And you left me here. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. I made mistakes, he said. The words were not easy for him. I was dealing with. I don't want an explanation, Selene said. I want to know why you're here now. Something sharp moved behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being interrupted. He wasn't used to a servant girl sitting across from him and cutting through his sentences with the clean authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. The 3 council members who arranged your father's death, he said, have begun moving against me. The treaty documents your father was carrying. I've been working for 4 years to reconstruct them. I recently located a piece of that puzzle I didn't expect. he paused. Your father gave your mother something before he died. A token, small, probably seemed meaningless to you. Selene's hand moved to her collar before she could stop herself. The small action was instinct, old reflex. Kale's gaze dropped to the motion and stayed there. Selene went still. The cord around her neck held a piece of carved bone, a fragment. Really no larger than her thumbnail. She'd worn it her whole life without knowing what it meant. Her mother had pressed it into her hand in the week before she died, told her to keep it always, and never show it to anyone. She had never shown it to anyone, but she'd touched it for 11 years, reflexively, in moments of anxiety or comfort. And she had just done it in front of the Alpha King of the North. What did your mother give you? He said quietly. The fire popped. The shadows shifted. Selene looked at him across the orange light and thought about all the years of being small and invisible and safe. Thought about the cost of that safety. Thought about a father who had died for a treaty, and a mother who had died of grief, and a girl who had grown up sleeping in ash. Slowly, she reached into her collar and drew out the cord. The bone fragment was carved with markings so fine you almost couldn't see them. Geometric, interlocking, the kind of craft that required extraordinary patience. At its center, barely visible, was a seal. Old, official. Cale Ardenmore leaned forward. When he saw it, the color left his face. Part 5, The Language of Bone and Blood. Do you know what that is? He said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but with something underneath it now. A tension that lived below the composed surface. My mother said it was my father's, Selene said. It's a verification seal. He said the words carefully, as if their weight required special handling. The kind used only once, for documents of the highest classification. Once, pressed into wax and broken, the piece passes to the most trusted witness. Proof that the document exists, that it was legitimate, that it was seen. He looked up from the fragment to her face. This piece corresponds to a document I've been searching for. A treaty that, if authenticated, would expose the men who killed your father and bring a formal case before the High Council. Selene turned the fragment over in her fingers. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary feeling object. For 11 years she'd thought of it simply as the last piece of her mother. Something warm and personal, nothing more. You came to Blackmere for this, she said. I came because I recently learned that Selene Voss had a daughter who survived. I came because I should have come years ago. He paused. Yes, I needed to know whether the seal still existed. And if I hadn't been wearing it? The question sat between them. Then I would have found another way, he said. But the treaty authentication would have taken longer. And the men moving against me. He stopped. There isn't much time, Selene. It was the first time he'd said her name aloud. Something happened in her chest when he said it. A sensation she didn't have immediate vocabulary for. Not warmth exactly, not comfort. Something more complicated than either. The sound of her real name in someone's voice, in this context, after all these years, felt simultaneously like rescue and exposure. She closed her fingers around the bone fragment. If I give you this, she said slowly, what happens to me? It was the most important question, the only question. She'd been here long enough to know that the moment useful objects were removed from useful people, those people tended to become expendable. Cale held her gaze. You come with me, he said. The words were simple, clean, offering no elaboration that would make them easier or harder to accept. To the Northern Court, Selene said. Yes. As what? A pause that lasted precisely long enough to tell her he'd anticipated this question, and wasn't entirely certain how to answer it. As someone under Crown protection, he said finally. What that becomes, that depends on things we can't determine tonight. It was an honest answer. She hadn't expected an honest answer. She did not give him the seal that night. She asked for time to consider, and he gave it to her. 3 days, he said, because that was what his circuit of the Northern Packs allowed. She returned to her mat by the hearth, and lay in the dark with the bone fragment pressed in her palm, and thought about the specific nature of traps, about how they could be baited with things that looked exactly like freedom. But she also thought about her father, about a man she barely remembered, a tall shape, a low voice, the smell of leather and cold air, and something she now understood was the nervous energy of someone carrying enormous responsibility. She thought about what it meant that he'd died for something that still mattered. That the thing he'd died for was still unfinished. That the men who'd arranged his death had been untouched for 11 years. And were now apparently moving as against the king she'd secretly, in the long dark watches of sleepless nights, held partially responsible for her own abandonment. She thought about anger. She had a great deal of it, banked down low like coals that had been waiting a long time for air. On the second day, Marin found her in the corridor outside the scullery, and gripped her wrist with fingers that left marks. "You will not speak to the Alpha King again," Marin said. Her voice was low and very controlled. "You will not draw his attention. You will not exist in his sightline unless you are serving a meal. Do you understand me?" Selene looked at the beta female's hand around her wrist, looked at the marks the grip was leaving, looked up into amber eyes that held something she hadn't expected to see there. Fear. Marin was afraid. Not of the Alpha King, necessarily. Of something connected to him. Connected to Selene being seen. "Who told you to watch me?" Selene said quietly. Marin's grip tightened. "Do not ask questions above your station. Someone told you to keep me invisible." Selene heard her own voice with a kind of distant surprise. It was level, precise, the voice of someone who had just understood something important. "The same people who placed me here 11 years ago. They know the Alpha King is asking about me, and they're afraid of what I might tell him." Marin said nothing, but the fear in her eyes became confirmation. Selene freed her wrist with a small, steady pull and walked away. Part 6. The night before leaving, she went to him that night. Not because he'd summoned her. Not because she'd made a clean, rational decision. Because Marin's grip on her wrist had been the final proof she needed. That staying here, being invisible, being safe, had always been an illusion. The people who'd placed her here could remove her at any moment. They'd kept her because she was ignorable. The moment she became relevant, they would simply make her disappear. Her father had known something worth dying for. It was time she decided if she did too. The crown guard woman with the silver nose ring admitted her without surprise, which told Selene that Kale had given standing orders. He was awake, working at the desk by candlelight, maps and papers spread around him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted. Relief, she thought, though on him it manifested so subtly it might have been nothing. She held out her hand, palm up. The bone fragment lay on it, cord coiled around it. "I'm coming with you," she said. He rose from the desk, came to stand before her. She had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes at this distance, and she noticed things she hadn't been close enough to notice before. The faint scar along his jaw, the exhaustion that lived behind his composure, the way he held himself with the particular stillness of someone who has trained themselves to waste no motion. He looked at the seal in her palm, then at her face. "You're sure," he said. "Someone already tried to warn me away from you today," she said. That decided it. Something moved behind his eyes. Something quick and dangerous. Who? The beta female. But she was following someone else's instruction. Someone who knew you'd make contact with me and wants to prevent it. He was already thinking, she could see it. The machinery of his mind working behind his eyes with the efficiency of someone who collected information, the way other people collected grievances. "We leave at dawn," he said. "Tell no one." "I own nothing worth packing," she said. "I'll be ready." She turned to go. Selene turned back. He was still standing where she'd left him, the candlelight making shadows that softened the controlled severity of his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the 11 years. For not coming sooner. I know that isn't." He paused. The words seemed to cost him. "I know it doesn't repair anything, but I want you to know I know that." The thing she felt in response to that was so complicated she had no framework for it. Gratitude and anger, and something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was perhaps the seed of it, lying dormant in ground that had been cold for a very long time. "We can discuss what it repairs later," she said. "If there is a later." She left before he could answer. Part 7. The road north. They rode out of Blackmere at first light, before the compound was fully awake. Selene had, in the end, one thing to pack. The gray dress she wasn't wearing, rolled into a tight cylinder. Everything else, the mat, the sooty wool blanket, the chipped cup she'd used for 11 years, she left without sentiment. They were things the place had given her. and she was leaving the place. The crown guard surrounded them in a tight formation. 12 riders, their breath visible in the cold dawn air, horses moving with the silent efficiency of animals trained for exactly this kind of departure. Selene rode in the center of the formation on a bay mare that was objectively the most comfortable horse she'd ever been on, which was easy, since she'd ridden exactly twice before in her life. Kale rode beside her for the first 2 hours without speaking. She didn't mind silence. She'd made a life in it, but it was a different kind of silence from what she was used to. Not the pressed-down, careful silence of someone trying to be invisible, but the easy silence of two people who didn't need to fill space. She noticed that too, and filed it somewhere. By mid-morning they were well into the mountain passes, the keep lost behind several ridgelines. The air up here so was clean and knife-cold and smelled of pine and ice. And Selene breathed it in with the specific hunger of someone who had been breathing soot for 11 years. "You ride well," Kale said, his first words of the day. "I don't," she said honestly. "I just don't fall off." A pause. Then, very quietly, "That's what riding well is in the beginning." She glanced at him sideways. The corner of his mouth had moved. Not quite a smile, a something. Something shorter and more internal than that, a private acknowledgement. She looked away before he could catch her looking. That evening they made camp in a sheltered valley, and the Crown Guard established a perimeter, with the practiced speed of people who did this routinely. A fire was built. Food was produced from packs she hadn't seen loaded, and Kaisel sat beside the fire with a map on his knee, and the bone fragment, which she'd given him, in his hand, and the orange light caught the carved markings and made them glow. "The treaty," she said, sitting across from him. "What does it actually say?" He looked up from the map. "It establishes formal territorial rights for 6 eastern packs. It removes 2 council members from their positions, the ones directly involved in engineering the arrangement with Blackmere. It creates a new oversight body with representation from packs below the alpha tier." He paused. "Your father built it over 4 years. It would have been the most significant restructuring of Northern Pack governance in a century." "And the 3 men who stopped it, who are they?" He looked at her steadily. "High Council ex Marin." She blinked. "Marin, the beta female's father by bond. Not blood, but bond. He placed her in Blackmere specifically. She's been his watcher." The pieces settled into place with the specific nausea of a picture becoming clear. "And the other 2? "I'll tell you more when we reach the court," he said. "There are people traveling through these roads who carry information faster than we do, and the less said in open air, the better." She accepted this. She realized, beginning to understand the shape of the world she was moving into. A world her father had inhabited, one of layers and calculations and information as currency. She had no training for it. But she had 11 years of watching people from shadows, of understanding what they meant rather than was what they said, of noticing the small betrayals of posture and eye movement that accompanied every human untruth. That was its own kind of education. Part 8. What burns underground on the 4th night, something happened. They had made camp on a high plateau that offered long sightsets lines in every direction. Standard security, Selene had figured out, for a formation that might be tracked. The guard had expanded slightly, 2 additional riders having joined them from a pre-arranged meeting point that afternoon. Selene was awake in the 3rd hour after midnight when she heard the scout's whistle. 2 short notes, the unknown movement signal. She'd learned the guard's communication patterns in 4 days of careful listening. She was on her feet before anyone came to wake her. Kale was already at the fire, dressed, speaking to the guard captain in low tones. He looked at her when she appeared, and didn't seem surprised. "Riders," he said. 8 of them, coming from the south. "From Blackmere? Likely. Moving too fast for casual travel." "They're not coming to escort us," Selene said. "No." She thought of Marin's grip on her wrist, of the fear in those amber eyes, of the information now safely tucked inside Kale's travel case, information that, if authenticated, would destroy Vex Marin and 2 others. Of course they'd sent riders. "We move," Kale said. Not a question. They broke camp in 8 minutes. Selene had watched them do it as a drill. She knew now it wasn't a drill. They moved into the dark of the pass, the horses picking their footing by instinct, where torchlight couldn't reach. And for the next 2 hours, the world narrowed to the sounds of movement and the cold breath of mountain air. The pursuing riders found their camp, abandoned. She heard the distant sounds of it. Horses stopping, voices carrying on the wind, the frustrated short silence of people who've missed what they came for. Beside her, in the dark, Kale's horse moved close enough that his knee almost touched hers. "You're not afraid," he said quietly. "I'm terrified," she said, equally quiet. "I've learned that being terrified and being still can look identical from the outside." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "Serving dinner to people who didn't see me as a person," she said. "You observe things, in that position. 11 years of observation." More silence. Then, "What did you observe tonight that I missed?" The question surprised her. That he'd ask. That he'd mean it sincerely. "Your guard captain was reluctant to break camp," she said. "He wanted to hold the high ground and intercept. You overruled him. That tells me you believe whoever sent those riders has more of them. That fighting off 8 in the dark would only be the first engagement." A beat. "Yes," he said. "How many more do they have?" "Enough that I'd rather not engage until we're on ground of my choosing." "How far is that?" 2 days, if we push." She settled into the saddle and looked at the dark ahead. "Then we push," she said. Part 9. The slow thaw. They pushed. 2 days of hard riding, minimal rest, food eaten in the saddle. Selene's body ached in ways she didn't have names for, and she developed a profound respect for the endurance of the Crown Guard, who never complained, and a complicated feeling about the Alpha King, who pushed as hard as any of them, and seemed to regard physical difficulty as simply a variable to manage. In those 2 days, in the narrow margins of conversation that exhaustion permitted, she learned things. She learned that he'd taken the throne at 27s, when his father died under circumstances that were politely called sudden. She learned that the 3 council members she was now apparently at war with had supported his ascension, which he'd realized years later meant they'd calculated he would be controllable. And the long work of his reign had been the quiet process of proving them wrong. She learned that he had no mate, no declared heir, and that this fact had been a source of political pressure for 4 years. "They want you to bond with someone they've chosen," she said. "They want me to bond with someone whose family's alliance would give them leverage," he said. "It's the same thing from their perspective. And you've refused. I've delayed." "There's a difference?" A glance. Something in it that she wasn't sure how to categorize. "The difference matters," he said. "For now." She didn't push it, but she thought about it. About the specific weight of that qualifier. For now, the way it opened and closed at the same time. She thought about other things too, in the long hours of riding. She thought about the way he'd looked at her at the Blackmere dinner. The recognition before he should have been able to recognize her. She thought about the 3 years he hadn't made his circuit of the northern packs. What he'd said about mistakes and things that needed longer to correct. She thought about a king who had carried guilt for 11 years, and come north himself, personally, when he could have sent an emissary or a letter or nothing at all. She was not ready to forgive. 11 years was too long for a clean, simple forgiveness, but she was beginning to understand that the architecture of what had happened was more complex than she'd been able to imagine when her world was the size of a keep, and her name was Ashgirl. Understanding was not the same as forgiveness. But it was something. Part 10. The Northern Court. The Northern Court was not what she'd imagined. She'd thought it would be a place of cold grandeur, all black stone and iron, and the performative severity of power on display. And it was those things, partially. The great citadel of Ardenmoor sat on a ridge above the river valley like something grown, rather than built. Its towers reaching into the low winter clouds, its walls the color of storm water. But inside, it was alive in a way Blackmere had never been. The citadel contained hundreds of people, staff, warriors, advisors, scholars, healers, the whole complex ecosystem of a ruling seat. Sound and movement everywhere, organized and purposeful. And at its center, the mechanisms of governance humming, with the careful energy of a place that understood it existed to make things function. Selene had been in a room. A room with a door and a window, and a bed with a real mattress. and the experience of closing that door and sitting on that bed and understanding it was hers, at least for now. Was so disorienting, she sat there for several minutes just breathing. Then she stood up and went to find out what was happening. What was happening was urgent and complex. In the 3 weeks following their arrival, Selene learned the shape of the crisis that had been building before her involvement. The 3 council members, Vex Marin, High Arbiter Sereth Call, and the border governor Aldrich Vane, had been quietly moving pieces into position for a challenge to KL's authority. Using the ancient pack law called the Governance Petition, they intended to force a formal review of his rule before the full council. A mechanism that could, if invoked correctly, suspend his authority during the review period and install a temporary governance committee, which they would control. The bond seal that Selene carried, her father's verification mark, was one of 3 pieces needed to authenticate Riven Voss's treaty documents. KL had the second. The third was held by a woman named Eris Voss, a name that struck Selene like a stone between the eyes. Eris Voss, she said. That's your father's sister, KL said quietly. Your aunt. Another thing no one had told her. Another room in a house she'd thought she knew the layout of, revealed to have more chambers than she'd been allowed to discover. She's alive, Selene said. She's alive, in the Eastern Territories. She's been waiting carefully, quietly, for 11 years. She knew about you. She believed you were watched too closely to contact safely. She was right, Selene said. Yes. The treaty, if authenticated with all 3 seals and presented to the full council before Marin and the others could invoke the governance petition, would expose their crimes and remove their standing to bring any petition at all. It would be, in the language of pack law, a preemptive counterclaim of treason. It would also require Selene to stand before the full council and testify. As what? She said. The same question she'd asked in Blackmere. I'm not pack. I'm not ranked. I have no legal standing before a council of alpha-level wolves. Kale looked at her across his desk. There's a way to give you standing, he said. She waited. If you were declared a ward of the crown, he said carefully. Or, if you were bound to someone with council-recognized status. He stopped. Started again. There are multiple legal mechanisms. We're working through them. She noticed what he'd not quite said. Noticed the careful navigation around it. Filed it. Work faster, she said. When does the petition come? If they're following the schedule I believe they're following. 22 days. And your aunt, Eris. How long to reach her? A week there, a week back. Then someone needs to leave immediately. I can't go personally. Leaving the Citadel right now would be exactly what they'd want. Then I'll go, Selene said. The room went quiet. Part 11. What grows in dark places, he tried to argue. She didn't let him. The logic was simple. She was not the Alpha King, not a political figure. Not someone whose absence from the Citadel could be used as a tactical move against the crown. She was, officially, still nothing. A servant girl from Blackmere who'd arrived with the king's retinue and was of no established importance. The council members wouldn't be watching her, they'd be watching him. She could move without raising alarms. You don't know the eastern routes, he said. Send one of your guards who does. I'll go as a companion. It's dangerous. Everything is dangerous. I've been in danger for 11 years in a place where no one was looking after me. At least this danger serves a purpose. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back. Really looked in the way she'd been carefully not doing for the weeks since Blackmere. And saw the toll of it all in the lines around his eyes, the particular quality of tiredness that came not from lack of sleep, but from the sustained effort of holding too much. I want to protect you, he said. It came out with less control than his usual speech. Rougher, more direct. I know I don't have the right to want that. I know what I owe you is an accounting of what happened, not an authority over what happens next. I know that. He paused. But I want it. Something in her chest cracked open slightly, like ice in spring. Then let me do this, she said. Let me be useful to a purpose my father believed in. That's the only kind of protection that means anything. Not wrapping me in guards, but giving me something worth doing. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. The journey east took 9 days. She traveled with a guard named Soren. Compact, quiet, excellent with both horses and maps, and a cover story about a trade envoy's assistant, and she thought about her father every mile of the way. Heiress Voss was a woman of 50. With Selene's same dark eyes, and a directness that felt like looking into a mirror aged forward 3 decades. She received Selene in a farmhouse that was ordinary on the outside and inside, a careful archive of 11 years of waiting. "I knew you'd come eventually," Eris said. "Not I hoped. I knew." The certainty of a woman who had arranged her patience like furniture. They sat together for 2 days. Selene listened. To the aunt she'd never known. To the history of her father. Not the abbreviated, official version, but the full weight of him. His brilliance, and his stubbornness, and the particular quality of his belief in the treaty he'd built. He used to say, Eris told her, that the best legal instruments are the ones that outlast the people who try to destroy them. He built this treaty to be survived. He just didn't know he'd have to survive it posthumously. Selene left on the 3rd morning with the 3rd seal. A twin of hers, bone and carved marks, pressed into her hands by her aunt, who gripped her wrists with something that was not quite the same as Marin's grip 11 years ago, and was also nothing like it. "Come back after," Eris said. "When it's done, come find me." "I will," Selene said. She meant it. Part 12. The council chamber. She arrived back at Ardenmoor with 5 days to spare. The court had shifted in her absence. The pressure of the coming petition visible in the way people moved and spoke. The increased guard presence. The controlled urgency behind closed doors. She went directly to Kael's study and found him. For the first time since she'd known him, showing the cracks. He stood when she entered. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, and she understood that the past 9 days had been difficult for him in ways that were not entirely political. She placed the 3rd seal on his desk. He looked at it, looked at her. Something his expression that she was no longer able to misread as politics. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words, but the way he said them, the specific weight of it, the effort it had cost him to not say something more, something larger, told her more than a longer speech would have. "Avertase it," she said. "Tell me what we need for the council." The morning of the petition, the chamber of the full council was everything she'd imagined, and then some. A great circular room of pale stone. The council seats arranged in tiers. The floor open and flat where those presenting their case would stand, carried with unnerving clarity. Nothing said in this room could be taken back. Selene stood in the center of that floor. She had been given status, ward of the crown, formalized 2 days ago with the documentation that gave her legal standing. She wore dark blue, the closest thing to formal she'd been provided. She held nothing in her hands. The seals were in the authenticated documentation, already registered with the council's own record keeper. Vex Marin sat in the 2nd tier, flanked by Sereth Call and Aldrich Vane. She saw his face when she entered, saw the moment he recognized her, saw the rapid calculation behind his eyes, saw the moment he understood that she was not, in fact, the invisible nothing they'd made her. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching. 11 years of learning to make herself utrosinst turned inside out. She was done being invisible. She was done existing in margins. She spoke for 40 minutes. She spoke about her father, what he'd built, what he'd believed, why it mattered. She spoke about a treaty that had been designed to outlast the people who destroyed it. She presented the authentication of all 3 seals. She presented the documentation her father had embedded in the treaty's structure. A secondary layer of records that named, clearly and with evidence, the specific individuals who had arranged his death, and the specific mechanisms they'd used. The chamber was absolutely silent. At the 40-minute mark, the Vex Messin stood and said, in a voice that was trying to be authoritative and almost achieving it, "This document cannot be authenticated. The witness is not." "The witness," said Kael Ardenmoor from the Alpha's seat above the chamber floor, "is the daughter of the treaty's primary architect, holding the verification seal passed to his chosen witness at the moment of the document's creation. The authentication is complete and registered. And the governance petition you filed this morning." He paused, and the pause was surgical. is hereby formally challenged on the grounds of the treason documented in these records. The chamber erupted. Epilogue. The girl with her name back it took 60 days for the legal process to complete. 60 days during which the Citadel was its own kind of battlefield. Legal. Arguments and counter-filings and 3 separate hearings. During which Selene sat in rooms full of wolves, who had enormous amounts of power and spoke in languages of law and precedent and authority, and held herself steady by remembering a girl on a mat beside a cold hearth who had learned that stillness could look like strength. Vexmaren was stripped of his council seat on the 40th day. Sereth Call and Aldrich Vane, 17 days later. The treaty, her father's treaty, was formally ratified on the 58th day, 11 years after it was supposed to have changed the structure of the Northern Pack world. The Eastern Packs received their territorial recognition. The oversight body her father had designed was formally constituted. It was, by any measure, the most significant governance shift in the North in living memory. Selene stood in the ratification chamber and breathed through it. She had thought she would feel larger in that moment. She had thought the completion of a thing would feel like arrival. What she felt instead was quieter than that. An internal settling, like stones finding their final resting place. Her father had built something that outlasted him. She had carried the piece of it that survived. That felt like enough. On the 61st day, she went to find KL. He was in the high tower of the Citadel, where he apparently went when he needed to think. She'd learned this gradually, the way you learn the geography of a place you're beginning to call home. She climbed the stairs and found him at the window, looking out over the valley where the river ran dark between snow-edged banks. He heard her come in but didn't turn. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She came to stand beside him at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air of the tower room. "I owe you a debt," he said, "and not the kind that can be paid in formal declarations and ward status." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "We were both instruments of something larger than either of us. My father's work, 11 years of patience. Your 4 years of trying to reconstruct what was destroyed." She paused. "We're even." He turned then, looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that she'd stopped trying to read from safe distance, and started simply receiving. "I don't want to be even with you," he said. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. She looked at him, at the Alpha King of the North, who was also a man who'd spent 4 years carrying guilt like armor, and had finally found the courage to put it down. Who had spoken her real name when everyone else had forgotten it. Who had asked what she'd observed and meant the question. "What do you want?" she said. He reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm against the cold of her cheek. "To call you by your name," he said. "For a long time. For as long as you'll allow it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the window. Let her shoulder rest against his. Felt the warmth of him settle around her, like something she was just beginning to believe she deserved. Below them, the river moved through the valley, dark and constant and persisting through the cold. "Selene Zin," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "That's it. That's the name." And in the tower above the river, in the citadel that was beginning to feel something she could inhabit, she let herself be called by the thing she was. Not Ashgirl, not a useful silence, not a piece of a dead man's unfinished work. Selene Voss, daughter of Riven, witness, ward. Woman who had survived 11 years of being made invisible and emerged from it with her eyes open. The winter light came through the window and fell across both of them, and was not, for once, a thing she needed to be careful of. It was simply light, and she stood in it. The fire she had tended for 11 years had finally turned its warmth toward her, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid of burning. What did you think of Selene's story? Drop your reactions, theories, and feelings in the comments below. And if you want to know what happens next between Selene and KL at the Northern Court, let us know. Your responses shape what comes next. Share.